Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. I am your host of Bannon, and I have with me today a man by the name of Barry Bowen. He's a staff private investigator at Trinity Foundation. Now, this episode here is going to have a very, maybe I should say, ominous vibe to it because we're going to really be digging down into some mega church filth, uncovering a few things. And we're opening your eyes to some facts that you may not know. Now you got to make your own, draw your own conclusions and everything like that. Our aim here is to share knowledge with the world. So, Barry, how are you doing today?
I am doing well and ready to have a busy weekend then.
Mm. Hallelujah, tabernacle and praise. I know that's right. And so right off the bat, I just want to tell everyone the website is trinityfi.org. As always, this will go in the showy notes, as I always do. I want to put that out there right now because everyone's going to need to go to this website. I need you to go to this website. My head was fucking hurting. It was like split down the middle, like I had been cracked in the noggin with an axe or some shit as I was reading through the articles tab, which is where Barry's work is, and all of this different investigative journalism this man has done over the years and years and years. And so we're going to be uncovering a lot of things. You're coming from a 15-year history in journalism. Tell us about your background.
In 2000, I started a website, christianheadlines.com. It was sort of like the Drudge Report of Christianity. Every day I would look for articles of interest to Christians and link to them. So in the course of doing that website, I would start coming across regularly articles about bad pastors, people in the church committing crimes. And I knew about Trinity Foundation, a watchdog organization, and started emailing them tips, news articles that I was coming across. And eventually, I reached a breaking point. One night, I was flipping through the TV channels and I came across a televangelist named Mike Murdoch. And he was doing the standard begathon or just begging for money. And he said, sow a seed on your credit card and God will erase your credit card debt. I wanted to jump through the TV set and hit the guy. I did not. The TV survived. But when that incident happened, I thought, I am going to take you down. And so I started investigating the televangelists more. Oh, and I found out about 990s. These are financial documents that nonprofits file. Now, churches, synagogues, mosques are exempt from filing, but other religious organizations are required to file them. So I started digging into these kind of financial documents, eventually started doing corporation searches to learn about who makes the key decisions in the organizations, how they hide their assets. Then I learned eventually how to track their aircraft. So it's been an interesting ride. In 2005, I read an article about Dean Zerby. He was a congressional investigator. He was the attorney, the counsels counsel for the Senate Finance Committee, which at the time was headed up by Senator Charles Grassley. And in this article, it talked about that Dean Zerby was investigating half a dozen nonprofits for fraud. And I was thinking, this guy should investigate the televangelists. So I contacted Trinity Foundation. The president at the time was Ole Anthony. And it's like, Ole, you need to contact this guy. Send him send him your Benny Hinn brief. So just a couple months earlier, Trinity Foundation had challenged Benny Hinn, the televangelist, his tax exempt status. Through dumpster diving, they go through the trash. They found out that the IRS was questioning it whether or not Benny Hinn Ministries should be considered a church. And so Trinity Foundation did this report to the IRS, and so it was sent that report was sent to Dean Zerby, this investigator that worked for Senator Grassley. And he looked at it, the email, and he looked at the report, and he told us that they would need to wrap up the current investigations before the Senate could investigate these religious nonprofits. So that was 2005. November 2007, it became matter of public knowledge. One night, I think maybe 2 in the morning, on the Senate Finance Committee, they sent out faxes to 6 TV ministries demanding their financial records. And those ministries were fitting in Kenneth Copeland, Creflo Dollar, Eddie Long, Joyce Meyer, and Paula White. And it was a media circus the next day when the news media found out about this Senate inquiry. So Grassley was interested in nonprofit organizations were abusing their tax exempt status. He started investigating nonprofits in 2001. And this all happened because of September 11th, the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers. When that incident happened, the American Red Cross set up, I believe they called it the Victory Fund, and hundreds of millions of dollars were donated nationwide to go to the families of the victims. Well, the American Red Cross decided to divert some of those funds. And when that was discovered, when that was reported in the news, it led to state attorney generals investigating. It led to Congress investigating. The president of the American Red Cross resigned. It really hurt the reputation of the organization. What a lot of people don't know is when you give to a specific cause, specific purpose, those are called restricted donations. And if the money is spent other than how the donor intended, it can be fraud. Now, it's IRS typically doesn't investigate this, normally be a state attorney general that does. It could even be a local district attorney, but generally they don't investigate these things. So in churches, when people grew up in churches, they'll often remember those old offering envelopes. And you could check mark on it if the money was go, you wanted to give to the church building fund or to missions, different purposes. So if that money wasn't spent the way the donor intended, that's possible fraud. And so Grassley, his staff, they started to investigate. 2006, there was elections and the Democrats took control of the Senate. Grassley went from being the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee to being the ranking minority member. So then in 2007, 2008 was the housing bubble burst. Well, there was bank bailouts. Well, how do you pay for it? That goes to the Senate Finance Committee. 2009, President Barack Obama and the Democrats pushed through Obamacare. Well, how are you going to pay for it? That goes to the Senate Finance Committee again. So this inquiry was sort of on the back burner for a long time. It did not turn out the way we wanted it to. When I suggested the Senate investigate, I was hoping that there would be hearings. In the 1950s and in the 1960s, there were 2 big congressional hearings into organized crime. Some of these mafia bosses were subpoenaed to testify before Congress. And you can watch some of the old videos on YouTube. They recorded on film back in the day. But that is what we were hoping. We were hoping to bring exposure. What happens is when these televangelists, often people around them don't want to go public. So you don't find out certain details until they reach the courtroom when somebody is under oath. And so we thought by forcing televangelists to testify, they could be grilled with the right questions. And so we like ask, did the church pay for your cosmetic surgery? When you flew the jet on this date to the Bahamas, did was that for a personal vacation? Did you reimburse the church for use of the jet? I mean, these were the kind of things that we wanted to bring into the public, but there would end up being no hearings. But in the meantime, I did property searches, corporation searches of these ministries, and we would forward that information to the US Senate. One of the things that we discovered was a number of these people were operating businesses from inside their churches. Paula White had a company, Paula White Enterprises, and that physical address was her church. So, is her business paying the church rent for use of the facility? These are the kind of question that an investigator would ask.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't know this, but churches are required to pay taxes on certain unrelated business income. So if a church is doing something like they have a facility that they're renting out, it could be taxable income. Now, the laws are weird. There are loopholes. If a building is paid off and you rent it out, it's not taxable. If you are paying a note on a building and you rent it out, then it's taxable. It's backwards, in my opinion. But there's a form that nonprofits and churches are required to file for this kind of revenue. It's called a 990T, and it discloses unrelated business income. We concluded that could have been the smoking gun that could have brought down a number of televangelists, that they are having revenue that they are not reporting that is not taxed. There's a really gigantic story I cannot disclose right now, but it's the investigations into this key issue, and it involves hundreds of millions of dollars.
Now, before we thank you for that rundown, and I don't know, man. I love what you're doing. The revelation of this is so heavy though, because as I was reading through your site and everything, and listening to I, I also want to give a shout out to our girl Tanya Levine down there in Australia. She's in Sydney, Australia, and she has a podcast called Leaving Hillsong. I discovered her on the Discovery Plus channel documentary. It's like Hillsong Exposed or something like that. It's called. It's a three-part documentary, and Tanya Levine was being interviewed in the documentary. She's the author of a book. I think it's called Leaving Hillsong too, or something like that. And, and she has a podcast called Leaving Hillsong. And Barry did a three-part interview with Tanya on there. So that's how I discovered Barry. And so, and Hillsong Church is going through all of this drama and stuff right now. But the information is like so heavy. You know, it really, really pains me that people go to churches for inspiration and to be inspired. And, you know, we put all this trust in these preachers. And so many times it's like, it's not, they don't turn out to be who we thought they are. But, you know, but when I think about it, as I'm listening to you speak, Joyce Meyer Crapful Dollar, why would I assume that there wouldn't be money mismanagement? You didn't say that there is, but I'm like, we just afford a certain level of trust to these people because who we believe they're supposed to be. We haven't looked into the books. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We just assume because they're a preacher that they're doing shit right. And that's not necessarily the case.
Well, in the case of the 6 TV ministries that the Senate tried to investigate, none of them filed a Form 990. And this financial disclosure document, you can obtain them at websites like GuideStar, ProPublica's nonprofit search page, and other places. These documents are matter public record. So a donor to one of these organizations can look and see where the money's going. And I believe in donor responsibility. I believe that donors that regularly give to an organization, they should check it out, make sure that money's being properly spent. I mean, I understand if you're giving $20 a one time donation to organization, you don't have to do a lot of research into it. But if you're like given to a church for year after year after year and it involves thousands of dollars, you really should check them out. So these 990s on the very first page, it includes total revenue, total expenses. It'll report if they have unrelated business income. It'll report the total number of board members, and it'll report the total number of independent board members. And that's really critical. Oh, wait, there's a couple of different kinds of 990s. There's a 990N, which is called a postcard 990 for organizations that have only a small amount of revenue. I forget the amount, if it's 50,000 or $100,000 or less, that you could file the postcard 990. Then there's a 990 EC. I think it's up to $250,000 revenue, but I have to verify that. You can file a 990 EC. And then, of course, the 990, regular 990. So we look at those documents, and the 990 also includes a statement of revenue page. So it explains where the revenue's coming from. Is it from like general contributions? Is it from a related organization? Things like that. Investment income, rental income. There is a statement of expenses page. So it'll list things like legal expenses. So if you see a large amount of legal expenses, you know that the organization may be going through litigation. Maybe they're suing someone or they're fighting a lawsuit. Then there is travel expenses. If that's really high, they may have a. So those are some of the things that stand out on, I think it's page 4. There's a yes or no question. If the organization has foreign bank or financial accounts, and then if they answer yes, the line below, they list what country it's in. And sometimes they'll use a country code, or sometimes they'll write out the country. So if you see Cayman Islands right there, it's like a red flag. Are they involved in offshore money laundering? Those kind of questions come up occasionally. That's some of the things I look for. It lists related organizations that those money can be moved back and forth through related organizations, shell companies, limited liability companies. And you mentioned the Hillsong podcast. One of the things that I investigated in Hillsong was their use of limited liability companies.
Wait, hold up. Hold up.
Here's-
Wait. Sorry to cut you off with that. We wanted to, I did mention the LLCs and I do want to get to that, but I wanted to touch on Lakewood Church first because that's like, Lakewood Church is like a pet peeve of mine and everything like that. I love your passion for what you're doing, and I can see why you have like a joy in your eyes and your voice and everything. And I'm happy you came across the whole Murdoch thing all those years ago that set you on this course, because who knew that such a time like this would come where we have all of this church fuckery happening. So we are gonna get on Hillsong in just a second, but I wanted to start with Lakewood Church first because this is near and dear to my heart because I talk about it quite often and extensively in my memoir about how I used to be a big volunteer there. Then I was dismissed, fired from volunteering because I'm not straight. And so this interview is not really focusing on the way Lakewood dehumanizes people behind the scenes and stuff like that. This is more like a financially corrupt based show, what we're talking about today. But I like to talk about Lakewood in this aspect. I really want to start with them because a lot of churches of various sizes look to Lakewood since they're the largest church in the country. So when I've attended other churches before, the preachers would always talk about Joel Osteen and how they want to be like him. And so the things that he's doing are things that other churches will mimic. If you go to different churches, they'll notice a practice at a church X, church Z, church J, and then they'll incorporate it into their own corporation. And so I really wanted to kind of dissect some of the things about Lakewood before we get into Hillsong And I think it's a very cute correlation because, Joel and Brian Houston, well, kind of the pastor of Hillsong, he had to step down. There's a whole scandal going on over there. They were always good buddies. You know, they would send Darlene Check, the worship leader from Hillsong, over to Lakewood, and then they would send Cindy Cruz Ratcliffe, the worship leader at Lakewood, over to Hillsong, and then Joel and Brian. I think I saw them on a telecast together, so they're all buddy buddy and shit. And so I wanted to start with Lakewood and seg with the Hillsong because of the way they like to hold those two churches like to hold hands and go skipping down the lily brushes and everything like that while they run over people along the way. And so in so Lakewood, the way they let's talk about the way they file their board of directors. So many churches have this whole thing that you would think, how shall I say, you would think that there's a whole like, okay, so when I was a member of the University Presbyterian Church here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, over at LSU, it was the most transparent church I've ever been to. You can see where all the money's going. They have this thing called the session that votes on things. And then when it's major decisions, actually the whole congregation can get together and vote. And this is not the case in these large churches. Their filings read things like the corporation shall have no members. In the case of Lakewood, to talk about that. So they originally were incorporated in 1959, I believe it was. So just bring us up to present. Talk about this whole the way these boards and then let's get very granular with how it is currently at Lakewood.
Like you said, Lakewood Church was founded in 1959. It was originally a Southern Baptist church, and eventually they amended their articles of incorporation so that the church became an independent, non-denominational church. They changed the name of it. I forget what the original name was. Eventually, in 2006, when they amended the articles of incorporation, it included this language. This is article number 2. The corporation hereby elects to have a sole member for the limited purposes and with only the duties, right, and powers set out in the corporation's bylaws. In the ordinary course of business, any action that would otherwise require a vote of members requires only a vote of the board of directors, and no meeting or vote of members is required. All rights that otherwise would vest in the members vest in the directors. So there's different forms of church governance. Originally, it looks like the church had maybe a congregational model where the members would vote on how the money was spent. I would have to go back and look at the original articles of corporation to verify that. But that was typically how most Southern Baptist churches were congregational. Some churches are hierarchical. Like, for example, the Catholic Church, you have a pope, then archbishops, then bishops below them. And so the decisions are made top down, but started with one person. Sometimes there's organizations where one person makes all decisions, and that's called a corporation sole. There is not Hillsong. There is this approach that Lakewood Church takes. I like to call it the board of directors model. They have specific people that make the key decisions. And in this case, they are almost all family members. The one exception at Lakewood Church is the treasurer. Noel Keller is the only non-Osteen family member that's on the board of directors. And this is a really critical issue. For example, just say that the board of directors were to vote on approving the salaries of the people on the board. You don't have any independent board members. So you would have possibly a family member voting on someone else's pay. I mean,
Okay.
Lisa Combs is Joel Osteen's sister. Her and her husband are on the board. Joel and Victoria are on the board, and then Noel Keller. So on a 990 form to get churches are not required to file these, but on a 990, I think it's Schedule J or the schedule right after that. There's this place where it indicates how the compensation is decided for key people. And you'll look and see if there's a box check marked for independent compensation committee, a compensation consultant. So in some of the large churches, a person can legally get paid a lot of money if you bring in a compensation consultant. They perform a study. They The board reviews their study. Then the person that's going to be voted on leaves the room, and then they vote on that person's compensation and record it in the board notes. That's how to legally get paid a huge amount of money in a nonprofit. Not just churches, but all nonprofits. The IRS has really shot themselves in the foot by not properly defining excessive compensation. Years ago, the NFL was a nonprofit organization, and Roger Goodell, however you pronounce his name, he was paid like over $30 million a year and is a nonprofit. That's just insane. But, and he was able to do that because they would compare his compensation with that of other CEOs, other not nonprofits. So,
You know,
so
so
Lakewood Church.
wait,
Church's governance model, you have this family board, and who is going to hold the family responsible? That is why it's very critical to have an independent board of directors.
when you mention how the salaries at the churches mimic that of the secular world, it just it really strikes a bitter chord within me because it just echoes back to how when it's convenient, the church wants to be like the world, but then when they want to cast judgment, then it's not okay to be like the world. So we don't want you to drink alcohol or do drugs or fuck outside of marriage because that's what they do over in the world. But I'll take that obscene salary, like they have over in the world because, we need a model to go by, right? So might as well pull it from the world. So and so yeah, you can tell this really pisses me off because, we sat there and we give all this money to these churches and just blindly, but we don't have any control or any power over what the fuck happens. And why would anybody knowingly want to do that? And this is different. Okay, so like if you're working for somebody at a job, they're paying you to be there. Okay, in exchange for your time. That company has a board of directors and they don't give a fuck about what you think either, unless you have stock in the company, and then they may not ask you then. But at least you're going to church, you're not being paid to come there. You're paying them, and the decisions that they make affect so much stuff. So here in the case of Lakewood, you got Joe, Victoria, Kevin, I think Paul's brother might be on the damn board too, making all the decisions. Okay, in the way the language is written, they don't give a fuck about what any of the members have to say. They want all the members to come there and the people around the world to send money, and then this group of 5 or whatever are gonna make all the decisions and just the end of it. And then your opinion doesn't count. So it's left up to the people to decide whether this is the sort of thing that they're okay with. We're not necessarily whether it's good or bad is up to you. But I didn't know this when I was a member of Lakewood Church. I did notice that they would make decisions like they would send, say, like Paul, because he's a doctor, medical doctor, on missions trips to Africa, say with his family. And I would be thinking, well, I would have loved to have gone on that missions trip. No one asked me if I could go. It was just the thing that was decided. Nobody said, hey, members, is it okay if we spend church funds to send him and his family on this missions trip? It was just done. And so, and that's just the way it is in a lot of these churches. Like, you give us the money because we're holy and we hear from heaven and everything like that better than you do. And then we're going to make all of these decisions. I was once okay with that. There's no way I would be okay with that again.
Yes. Me neither. My dad was a Baptist minister, so I grew up in the church. And the church that I attended was a congregational governance model. One Wednesday night a month, there'd be a church business meeting and there'd be a church financial statement. So you could see where how much money came in and where it was spent. And members would vote each year to approve the budget. My dad's salary was disclosed to the public. No, my dad was uncomfortable with that, but he knew that the church needed to be transparent. And my dad was not getting rich from being a minister in a church. But a lot of people, you don't, when you read the Bible, you don't necessarily see a congregational governance model. So you have some people say this is not biblical, as if just because something may not be listed in the Bible doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. So I think God can work through all kinds of different governance models, but I'm convinced that you need transparency and accountability. And if you lack neither, you're creating an environment where fraud can abound.
Right. So let me take this further with Lakewood. So in your on your website, you have an article that's called $1 Million Homes Become Status Symbols of Televangelists and Pastors. So on the one hand, and you get very granular, you show like satellite imagery of people's houses. You have Joel and Victoria's house in there. You have a couple of other ministers' house on there, and you see how much it's worth, so on and so forth. Now, in the case of Joel, you also mentioned that they have another house in California. I found it interesting that you had to use an informant to find this information out. I don't know why it would be such clandestine information. Why do you think he wouldn't want people to know he has another $1 million home somewhere?
People have multiple reasons for hiding their address. So in the state of Texas, Texas has higher property taxes than on a lot of states, I believe, because Texas does not have a state income tax. But in the state of Texas, each county has what's called an appraisal district. So in Houston, Houston is in Harris County. So you can go to that website, Harris County Appraisal District, and you can put in a person's name or the name of a business and you can look up their property. In the case of people who are celebrities, people that have had death threats, a lot of politicians have their information redacted. So you can't find them by searching by name.
Okay.
There are other methods you have to use to find their address. I'm not going to go into all that. So I don't want to clue in the televangelists to some of our investigative techniques. But so w- in Harris County, there is a property that where Joel Osteen owns it. There's another one there that I'm not sure if he owns it or not. We didn't go into detail in our article, but there's a house, and again, I don't know who lives there. It may be his sister. It may be his mom. I don't know if he owns it and rents it out. I think he has another house, but not certain about it. But they were previously in shell companies. They registered them there, and this is a way of trying to have more privacy. I get that there are certain people that don't want people driving by their house, trying to find them. They want privacy. I get that. But it can be a technique used for more sinister purposes. And we'll get to that later, I'm sure. So we had an informant tell us that Joel had a house in California. And once we found out that, and we knew that it was not far from the Pacific Ocean, I was on a tear. I was going through realtor websites, looking at recently sold houses that were expensive, trying to find out, are this in a gated community? Who bought it? Was it registered to a shell company? Oh, it was just crazy. But we did not have the right time period. He had lived in the house longer than we suspected, so I missed it in my research. Eventually, an informant let us know where it was. But the house, there was a real estate website that estimated it to be worth 5 million. But should a pastor live in these kind of expensive homes and expensive mansions? There's a Bible verse where Jesus said not to lay up treasures for yourselves here on earth, but to store them up in heaven. And when you've got a televangelist maybe spending over $10 million on a couple of homes, he maybe could have spent that money a lot more frugally and helped people with it. I think televangelists that are acquiring massive wealth are being disobedient to script. One of the craziest cases I've investigated is a guy named David Cirillo. He is president of the Inspirational Network. Many years ago, that was PTL, which was a TV network that Jim Baker started. After Jim Baker's scandals, it changed,
Mm.
switched ownership. But David Cirillo, in 12 years, was compensated $41 million. Yeah, Inspirational Network is a nonprofit organization. And so I would love to see the IRS revoke the tax exempt status of his organization. I really would. I'm hoping that one day they do.
So I don't. So I hear what you're saying about how you don't feel like preachers should have a lot of money. I kind of agree with it. I kind of don't. So like if they take like a salary from the church, I think I agree with you, like with what you're saying. If they make their money separately, like Joel and Victoria seem to, if they want to go buy expensive shit, I don't feel like that it is for me to control what they spend their money on. But a lot of people agree with your perspective though, because the optics of it looks bad to a lot of people. They just a lot of people just cannot get past the fact that a preacher lives that sort of lifestyle and they're seen, rubbing elbows with celebrities and stars and everything like that. It's like, okay, what is the difference? So I don't think you're wrong for thinking that way. But speaking of optics though, and I do want to remind people of just how much church, like Lakewood is a family business. When I was there filming my docuseries and everything like that, which is about to come up on my website, sexdrugsandjesus.com, that website, I noticed that now they now have pictures of like Joel and Victoria and their children, Jonathan, you know, plastered all over the building inside, just reminding you, in my opinion, of whose fucking house it is, you know, and everything like that. And so I get it's a generational thing. You had, I think it was John Osteen who handed the reins to Joel, and clearly they intend to hand it to to Joel's son, to Jonathan. I'm like, okay, it just hit me so like a slap in the face though. I'm like, okay, so when they stand on the stage, they're like, okay, you are Lakewood. They had this thing going for a while. Hashtag I am Lakewood. Many companies do that. I am Verizon. I am the Gap. Whatever you want to say to mindfuck people to make them feel like they are part of your organization when really they're kind of not, because they're bankrolling your organization. I am the Gap. Well, you're saying that because you want me to keep paying and buying your clothes. And so how am I part of the Lakewood family if I'm paying money in tithe and offerings, but you only got 5 family members making all the damn decisions? I'm a part of the family, but my opinion doesn't count. And again, this isn't just Lakewood. You have a lot of churches, run this way. This here is just like probably the highest example in the land. So speaking of optics, though, I wanted to touch on their whole PPP loan thing, a scandal issue that they had, because when I heard that, that really, really, really pissed me off because I believe that just because you can doesn't mean you should. And God knows our government is fucking corrupt. So the government allowed churches that do not pay taxes to get money because of the coronavirus. My thing was, you don't have any money invested into the tax pot because you don't fucking pay taxes. That's one. Secondly, all of y'all are rich enough, and I think the loan was still like 4, 5, 6 million. I'm all like, y'all got this money. You are not broke. Even if Joel and Victoria or somebody, if it was me and I was rich, to avoid the appearance of evil, like the Bible says, I would not have taken money from the government if I was the leader of a church when I already could have covered that personally. Just to not risk turning people away from Christ. Somebody may have been discouraged in their faith because the richest church in the country took a loan from the government when you had small businesses, like I have small businesses that couldn't get a fucking PPP loan and needed it, yet you have a church where you have millionaires who could have bankrolled it who chose not to. Talk about that.
In early 2020, I think it was February or March, the national lockdown happened for a couple of weeks. And then after that, various cities and states started also doing some lockdowning themselves. So the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, that was designed so that small businesses and nonprofits could maintain, so they could retain their employees. That was the key idea behind the Paycheck Protection Program. And after it was instituted, it was a failure in how it was set up. There was not proper screening. There's been a massive amount of fraud in the program. And these were forgivable loans. So, or and had the potential to be forgiven. So the Small Business Administration, working with a bunch of financial institutions, provided these loans. The churches and ministries would file an application, and in my own research, basically there was two. A lot of them got loans in 2020 and 2021. So over $100 million ended up going to churches with broadcast ministries, things like that. So Lakewood, they got a loan, and then because of the bad media coverage, they paid it back. And they were not the only one. When journalists filed a FOIA request, that means Freedom of Information Act, when they filed those to get the list of recipients, then it became public. And so you could go to, I think it was the Small Business Administration website to look them up. Then ProPublica created a PPP search page, which you could find it with a search engine, and you could type in names of ministries that you're curious and see if they got money. So we've got at Trinity Foundation, we got contacted by Inside Edition because some journalists were looking at religious organizations and they're curious about televangelists getting them. Well, when I found out that we could search the list of PPP recipients, I went wild on those searches. I did probably 200 searches in 1 week. And so we found out that Word of God Fellowship, that's that business name for Daystar Television Network, they got a loan. Well,
What?
what crazy about it was right after they got their PPP loan, they purchased a jet. So Inside Edition wanted to do an expose on that, and they contacted Daystar, Marcus Lamb for an interview and he declined. So then they knew if they're going to get him, it would be a hostile interview, unwanted. So a stakeout interview. So we tried to find out when and where he would be. And so that involves surveillance. Oh, yes, fun investigative times. So we found out that he was going to be at a golf course. They had a golf tournament, Daystar golf tournament. So Daystar's camera crew, the producer, Lisa Guerrero, and the cameraman were all in this van, and my boss and I were in other cars monitoring from Marcus would drive up to the golf course, and we missed him. He was in a black sports car when normally he wasn't in that vehicle, and so we did not catch him. They saw him when he got out of the vehicle in the parking lot. They ran over, pulled out the camera, and she got her interview, asked him a couple of questions before he entered the country club. And so that was fun doing that expose, that investigation.
Oh my God. Jesus Christ. I was, I pray for people who are confused religiously, who've looked at all of these things happen, and I pray that they find it's like spiritual peace, because it's very, very upsetting to people to now you and I are on the same page. I love me some good investigative journalism. Let's find the damn scandal and everything like that. Let's find the damn scandal and let's get after it and let's dig into it. But there are people who are really like I was angry, say, over like what Lakewood did, but there are people who are probably like devastated and brokenhearted and probably crying somewhere because their idol, Joel Osteen, allowed something like this to happen. You know, I preach a lot of spiritual independence. I want people to be able to go to God for themselves with or without a church, and to put pastors in their place, which is beneath God, which sometimes, a lot of times, we make idols out of pastors before we realize it. So, so my heart, and my soul and my love really goes out to people who feel confused and heartbroken and like they may not want to believe in God because of what these people have done. But remember, Joel, you know, Marcus Lamb over at Daystar, and everybody, and Joni Lamb and everybody, and Brian Houston and everybody. These are just people, y'all. And like people, they gonna fuck up. Now, what you're not gonna get from most preachers is an apology or an admission of guilt. Most of them do not tend to do that. It's just the way they are. And so, but remember, they are human. They are not the Lord. And whatever it is that they do, they did that. Every word that comes out of their mouth is not going to be divine. So you got to learn how to go to God for yourself. And remember that no matter what these people do, don't let that shake up your faith. Like, don't let them cause you to miss heaven and a peaceful life. So don't be like, well, God, I'm not going to fuck with you because of what Joel did or what because Creflo Dollar did. They stole from the church. How could they? I did that when I got kicked out of Lakewood for not being straight, and it took me 5 or 6 years before I was reconciled to God because I wasn't spiritually mature, and I don't want to see anybody else fall into having a gap in their spiritual life because of what a church did. Now, before we get into Hillsong, which is next, I want you to just tell people what a shell corporation is.
Shell company is a company to, it may not have any business purpose. It's just to hold an asset. So in the case of some of these televangelists we investigate, they will have a shell company that owns a jet. And so if you go to the FAA, the flight registry, that's the Federal Aviation Administration, there's a search page and you can type in the names of churches and ministries. And if you were to type in World Air, HEIR, you will find, I believe, two jets. And that company is headed up by Creflo Dollar. So he has two aircraft and a shell company.
So why not put those aircraft? I hear, under the church's name, because, so are they his or they belong to the church?
I am not clear on it. Some cases, the church or ministry could own the shell company. It could be a related entity. And typically in a 990, they will list related organizations at the very end. But again, if a church is not disclosing and as a shell company, you wouldn't know about it. Years ago, Ed Young Jr., he is the pastor of Fellowship Church in Grapevine, Texas. His He had a jet registered to a shell company, and I don't even remember the name of it. It was a really obscure name. It's not something that you'd think of and just type in a search engine from what I remember. But so, I mean, some of them, they don't want their donors to know that they live extravagantly, that they have a jet. That's just something, if the members know it, they may not be as inclined to give.
Well, I'm thankful for your website because, as I said at the beginning of this interview, we have our opinions, but what I want the world to do is to make your own opinion. You've got to do your own research, pray about it and see, and stop going to these churches, just giving them blind trust, no matter how cute they are or how flashy the worship is, blah, 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 blah. Stop letting them hypnotize you, and do your research and have your head in the game. So Hillsong. Now, this is going to be the last thing we're going to talk about during this interview. We're going to have to have you back on again. And I love how the conversation has gone. I love how so full of knowledge you are and how that spark just lights up in you. I believe, sir, you are, assuming you identify, as sir. I don't like to use a lot of sirs and ma'am. Sometimes they slip out. But, I feel like you are doing exactly what you were put on this earth to do. Like your energy, you feel perfectly centered, balanced, and aligned. And would you agree?
There's a verse in Ephesians that I'm going to paraphrase. It's in, I believe it's Ephesians 5, about exposing sin, bring it to the light, its true nature is revealed. I believe this verse justifies Christian investigative reporting.
Okay.
And I believe that Christian journalists, Christian media can play a powerful role in exposing sin in Christianity and calling for greater transparency and accountability. Now, accountability. So it really is a mission,
And you have to be,
on a mission from God to expose this kind of fraud that's in the body of Christ and extravagant lifestyles and other things.
you have to be very, very strong to do your line of work because, people like that are very rich and powerful and they're not accustomed to being accountable. Nobody around them is challenging them or anything like that. And they're not used to being told no. So you have a lot of forces working against you. And to get up, and go to work every day and to do it with a smile on your face, with the grace that you have, lets me know that God is with you because I know in a lot of high circles, you are not celebrated. You serve,
No.
you serve. I mean, can I call you sir? Is that
Yeah,
appropriate?
that's fine.
You sir are not celebrated. A lot of
I'm the enemy.
right. As am I. But you know what? I want to be a friend of, the people who don't have, the people who are trying to figure it out, and things like that. I've been homeless before. I've been to jail a bunch of times. I got felonies and stuff like that. You know, and a lot of that happened because I didn't have knowledge. And I'm not going to let that happen to someone else, and neither are you. Everything you're doing is about knowledge and empowering the individual to know what they're getting themselves into. So Hillsong Church. Now, y'all, this here is a scandal that is ongoing. Hillsong Church, I didn't know this till I saw that documentary. They got all these campuses worldwide. I didn't know. I knew about the campus in Australia, but I didn't know about all of this other shit they got going on. So this is evolving. So tell us, Barry, about their limited liability corporation setup.
Well, in the course of investigations, when a church becomes really popular, my curiosity guides me. And so when a church gets really popular, I'll just take a quick look at them just to see what's up. Do they have related companies, things like that. They're on aircraft. So, I'll go to the FAA website looking for Hillsong aircraft, never found any. As far as I know, they don't own any. They do use charter aircraft. There's a company in Australia that they use. I don't remember the name. But in the case of Hillsong, well, let me back up. There's a company called Bizopedia. And Bizopedia is a business corporation search site. You can find out a company if they're registered in different states, things like that. And you can search by name of company, name of officers, and address. And so Bizopedia is a key website in my investigative arsenal when I do investigations. So I go there and type in Hillsong, and I discover that they've got a number of listings in Virginia, for example, Virginia companies. Well, then from there, I go to the Virginia Secretary of State website. And it was puzzling to me because I discovered a number of their churches were registered as limited liability companies. Now, what is a big trend in business is that companies will separate assets and they'll use limited liability companies to protect those assets. There's less people to sue that way. For example, if you have a church with a business of with a board of directors like Lakewood Church, if you sue the church, you could end up suing all 6 board members. In the case of suing a Hillsong church in the US, like Hillsong NYC LLC, that's Hillsong New York City, you may have 1 or 2 managers listed. They don't have a full board of directors. And so it limits how many people can get sued. Also, it limits how many people can provide accountability. If you've got 1 manager, who are they accountable to? It's a big problem. So I actually asked a person that worked for the IRS if this was legal. I was curious, and he said, yes, it is. He wish it wasn't. But a lot of churches are creating shell companies, these limited liability companies, to hold the asset of the building. So their property will be put in an LLC. So if the church is sued, if they have a judgment against the church, then you don't have to lose all their assets, just the one that was involved in the legal issue. So this has become a standard practice. So, and in the course of investigating, we'll do 2 things. Well, more than that, but 2 of the big things is we're trying to follow the power. We're trying to follow the money. Follow the power. I mean by that, identify who the key decision makers are. So that's why you look for a board of directors, and for incorporated organizations. For LLCs, they have articles of organization, not incorporation. They're not a corporation. And typically list their manager on these documents. So then after we identify their company or organization names, then we can dig even deeper into property searches to find assets. And in the state of Arizona, I did a search and I found a large number of property listings. And PHX Holdings is a company that Hillsong set up in Maricopa County, Arizona, to hold property. And so when you see a large number of property listings, it can be a little misleading. So some of these are multiple lots, property lots that make up a parking lot, multiple lots to make up a large building. They even have some vacant lots there. There are no buildings on them for maybe future expansion. But they have 31 listings or did at one time in Maricopa County. So, and that was for 2 of their large churches. Also, that was where Hillsong College was. I think they're going to be moving it to California in the future. But so those are some of the things that I discovered in the course of examining Hillsong. Hillsong is a very personality driven church. It's famous for its worship teams. They have multiple Hillsong worship teams. One's Hillsong United. There's Hillsong Young and Free. They've sold, I believe, over 20 million albums worldwide. So that they're well known for their worship songs that are sung in a lot of churches and are played on Christian radio. But in the United States, Carl Lentz was pastor of Hillsong NYC, New York City, and he became like a celebrity. He developed relationships with actors, singers, people like Justin Bieber, and got a lot of media attention for it. And people would flock to their churches, and it'd be like going to a rock concert. There was a sex scandal there. He had an affair, cheated on his wife, was fired. We believe he's being rehabilitated. We think he's going to be possibly leading a church in Florida soon that's affiliated with ARC, Association of Related Churches. There's nothing been disclosed yet, as far as I know, but that's what it looks like. But Hillsong was founded in Australia. I believe you previously mentioned that. Frank Houston, the father of Brian Houston, was involved in the Assemblies of God, a well-known leader in that denomination in Australia. And Brian had started an independent church that he left the Assemblies of God. And this is a common theme. When you leave certain denominations, you can have less accountability. Brian's dad, Frank, sexually abused some boys. And this has become a big scandal. So, and for certain crimes, a pastor is called a mandatory reporter. If they learn of specific crimes, they're they're required to report them to law enforcement. And that would be if you learn about a murder, or you learn about certain sex crimes, you have to report it. And he failed to report his own dad. I mean, I would be the first to admit that would be very difficult, but it's the right thing to do. And because he failed to do it, there ended up being litigation and finally an investigation. And so we're waiting to see what the sentence will be. He could serve jail time in Australia for that. When you look at Virginia, the Secretary of State website, and when you look in some of the other websites, you'll notice that Hillsong had a number of companies. And we're going back to what we mentioned earlier. They have a Hillsong Music as one of their companies. They had a Hillsong channel, was they had a TV channel. Right now, I don't think it's on cable anywhere, or maybe if it is, it's maybe just in Australia. They have a streaming channel online, but they were previously in a relationship with TBN, and that ended. TBN handled the broadcast cable infrastructure for Hillsong channel, and that's gone away. Hillsong, there's so much money that can be made from this, and it can be traced. Some of these decisions can be traced to Carl Lentz's dad. Stephen Lentz was an attorney. He worked for Pat Robertson many years ago. He taught various classes at Regent University, and he wrote a book, The Business of Church. And in this church, he advises pastors on issues like copyright and how to protect assets through limited liability companies. And so, I mean, he advises pastors that if you can actually own the copyright for your sermons, your intellectual property, and then license it to the church. So, I mean, the church that I grew up in, if somebody wanted to buy a copy of a sermon years ago, they could get it on a cassette tape or CD for $1 or 2. I mean, the church wasn't interested in making money from it. It would just cover their cost. But now they're doing licensing of this content. They can put it on a website behind a paywall, for example, and you could become a subscriber to listen to their sermons. Now, some churches put it up there for some people post to YouTube, etc. But sometimes they'll turn their sermon series into a book. They can have a ghost writer listen to the sermons and write a book. So there's this business. And so in the course of Hillsong, they're mimicking the business world. It's like the church is becoming a business. And there's some interesting Bible verses about this. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 3, Peter's talking about false teachers that would be in the church. And he said that if you read this in the King James Version, it says that these teachers, they will make merchandise of you. They have turned the church into a marketplace. It's no different than when Jesus entered the temple many years ago and threw out the money changers. So what happened in the temple, they would do sacrifices. And if you didn't have a sacrifice, if you traveled to Jerusalem from far away, you may not have been able to bring an animal to sacrifice. So you'd buy one. So they were selling sheep at the temple. They turned it into a marketplace. And Jesus threw out the money changers. So if you read that same verse, 2 Peter 2, verse 3, like the New Living Translation, it says something like this: in their greed, they will make up clever lies to get hold of your money. It's one of my favorite verses about religious fraud.
You ain't lying. And the thing is, while they're trying to judge, my community for not being straight, calling us all pedophiles and stuff like that, they themselves are found within these pages, in my opinion, much more clear verbiage and wording than what they try to use to condemn me because I don't identify straight. I heard what you said about how they get a ghostwriter to listen to their sermons and write a book. I'm so glad you said that because I had read one of Joel Osteen's books when I was still a member there. And I was like, I read through it and I was like, gosh, I could have sworn I heard this like in a sermon before. And, and so I knew that because so there's like a system. Okay, so if you write a different sermon most weeks out of the year, that could be how they keep pooping out these books again and again and again. Every time you write a little sermon, you put them together, you got another book, another bestseller. So you're not necessarily getting totally fresh content with each of these books. It's just got a different cover on it, a few little shallow ass personal stories to make it feel like they're being authentic and vulnerable with you when really they're not. And shit like that. So you just validated me. I'm like, I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it.
Uh, Merchandising.
So, okay. So we're going to end this first interview here. People out there listening, you've heard what Barry and I have had to say, and this is only beginning. We're going to do this again. You can go over to the Leaving Hillsong podcast with Tanya Levine and listen to more of what Barry has to say. You can also go to the Discovery Plus app, Discovery Channel Plus app, however the fuck you say it, and find the Hillsong documentary there. And that motherfucker is full of some spicy hot tea. I was clutching my pearls, ripped them off, had to go buy a new set and come back again. I watched all 3 of those 1-hour episodes twice, and I'm going to watch them again because I've got some interviews coming up with some people from off the documentary that I was fortunate enough to land. So, Barry, thank you so much for coming on this first time. You are a well trove of knowledge. Like You're a very, 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 like, deep well of information. I love how invested you are in what you do, and you have true joy for your calling, and not a lot of people can say that. Do you have any last words for the world today?
Can't think of anything.
And so you don't have to because we'll be talking again. So y'all, his name is Barry Bowen. You want me to tell them your Twitter handle or?
That you can.
Okay, so on Twitter, he's simply at Barry Bowen. He likes to keep things, easy and simple. Now, the website where you can get all the tea and the information is trinityfi.org, which stands for Trinity Foundation International for short. So just trinityfi.org. It will all go in the showy notes. Blessings upon you all. Thank you, Barry, and everyone listen out for the second installment of this conversation. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for taking time to listen to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. It really means everything to me. Look, if you love the show, you can find more information and resources at sexdrugsandjesus.com or wherever you listen to your podcast. Feel free to reach out to me directly at devannon@sexdrugsandjesus.com and on Twitter and Facebook as well. My name is Devannon, and it's been wonderful being your host today. And just remember that everything's gonna be all right.